disappointment with God. And some of the things that cause us to question how God feels about us when we look at our lives and the things that we're experiencing. And when there's difficulties in our lives and sufferings, some chronic, it causes us to wonder whether we matter to God. That if we matter to God, wouldn't He spare us some of the struggles that we experience in an ongoing way? Sometimes it's not really looking at the experiences of our life, but kind of our behaviors. And we question whether somebody who struggles with the behaviors we struggle with, whether God could, we could matter to God by struggling with the things we struggle with. Jesus told a story about how God feels about those who fall short. Let's go through that. We'll actually spend a couple weeks looking at this. We read, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.' And Jesus told them this parable." Jesus is conversing with tax collectors and sinners. Sinners is in quotes, because this is a word that the Pharisees and tax collectors would have used to describe the people Jesus was conferring with. Jesus wouldn't have used that word. He didn't use that word. He called people who were straying and wandering, he called them lost. He didn't call them sinners. Those who consider themselves nearer and dearer to God, though, consoled themselves with the fact that God was even more frustrated with tax collectors and sinners than they themselves were. And that's what caused them to have issues with Jesus. In that culture, when you spent time with someone, you were communicating, you had a relationship with them. So if you were spending time with somebody at dinner or talking with somebody, you were communicating something not just to that person, but to the people who saw you together. And then Jesus, in being with those who were morally subject, he was communicating something about having a relationship with them. And that angered those who tried really hard and devoted huge amounts of time to try to make themselves obedient to God. Realizing that they were muttering, though, Jesus told a story. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. The story begins with the younger son requesting assets that will someday be his. The father has 2 children. The oldest one will end up inheriting 2/3 of the estate, and the younger one will end up inheriting 1/3. Usually, you waited for the father to die before the estate was carved up and the proceeds given to the surviving heirs, but this didn't happen in this case. The younger son wants his inheritance ahead of time. So the father, being willing, divides the estate. And again, if Jewish law prevails, the younger one will get 1/3. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Each son receives his due, and the younger son then is free to go. The younger son looks to sever his relationship to his father and go away, so he converts all that he has been given, land, and converts it to cash to make it liquid. And then he takes the proceeds of the inheritance and he ends up going to a foreign country and kind of burns through his inheritance. Apparently the elder son ends up keeping the investment, the land, and tending it. The younger son, then, when he has burned through the inheritance, there's another blow that comes. A famine hits that area, that part of the country. It says, after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. With no money and no family and suffering in a distant land, he is in trouble. He enters into poverty and has nowhere to turn. Desperate for food and for funds, to be able to have something to eat, he hires himself out to someone as a really low-level laborer. He works for a Gentile, which he would have been raised never to do, not to enter into any kind of relationship, especially business relationship, with a non-Jew, and is sent to an animal farm to tend the pigs. This was dishonorable for a Jew, since pigs were seen as unclean animals. There is no one in this distant land to offer him comfort or food. He has hit rock bottom. And then, as sometimes happens when you hit rock bottom, he has an epiphany, a moment of clarity. Something breaks into his consciousness that he has never considered before. This moment of clarity will be a turning point in this young man's life. It will lead him to make far different choices. There's three things that can change. Behaviors can change, attitudes can change, and beliefs can change. And behaviors are the things that we can see. Attitudes are visible. Beliefs are harder to see. And interestingly, the change in beliefs ends up becoming a pivotal moment in the life of this young man, because the change in beliefs is going to trigger a change in attitude. The change in attitude is going to trigger a change in behavior as well. It says, when he came to his senses, and coming to his senses, he sees something that he hasn't seen before. It might be that so much resentment has built up between he and his father that it got in the way of him really being able to see the character of his father at all. All he saw was limitations. And whatever happens, he ends up seeing his father for the first time, really. The change in perspective, notice how deep this change in perspective is and how quickly it changed his attitude and his behavior. It goes on, when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare?" He ends up looking at the situation he is in, and he knows that his father has hired men as well, and he compares and contrasts, and he starts to see his father in a new light. He says, "Here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.'" So he got up and went to his father. The son comes to his senses. He sees his father through the eyes of that he has now as a hired man, and he looks at what he is living on, and he remembers what the servants of his father lived on. And he starts to look at he starts to see his father as a provider. And he's never really looked at him from the perspective of a servant before. But from that perspective, and being one who is experiencing suffering, he has an epiphany, and he ends up seeing his father in a different way. It seems that resentment blinded him prior to this. All he could see when he saw his father was what was being withheld from him. And resentment was what clouded his vision and kept him from noticing not just the troublesome aspects of his relationship with his father, but the character of his father as well. Resentment can do that. But anyways, he sees his father in a new light from a servant's perspective. And this moment of clarity is the turning point. Biblically, what Jesus comes to do, and the reason why he tells this story, as we'll see, is to try to encourage this kind of shift in perspective. And he's trying to get them to understand you really do matter to God. He does care about you. Because when this thinking changes, then attitude will change and behavior will change. Sometimes we focus on, again, changing the behaviors. That's short-sighted because behaviors come from attitudes and attitudes come from beliefs. That's why biblically what Jesus came to do, he came to change our beliefs. He came to change the way we think about God. It says in John 17, the night before Jesus is going to go to the cross, and here's what he said. Father, the time has come to glorify the Son. He ends up saying, I have finished the work you've given me to do. This is before he goes to the cross. Now, Jesus did come to go to the cross. But the work the Father gave him, I want you to change the way people look at me. I want you to change the way people think about me. That's what Jesus came to do. So the words the Father gave him, he gave the disciple. These words, they remained in their minds. And you know what happens to words when you retain them? They begin to change the way you think. And that's what happened with Jesus and the disciples. He gave them words from the Father. They guarded these words. They made room for them. They thought about them little by little. These words started to change the way they looked at the Father, the way they thought about the Father. And this ends up, well, this is what transformation is about. And this is what Jesus came to do, to change the way we think about God. Because ultimately, whatever our issue is, resentment or grumbling, bitterness, fault-finding, it really stems from beliefs when we believe that God is holding out on us, that he can't love us because of our disobedience, or he doesn't love us because of our suffering. It's interesting, isn't it, that this young man, he comes to a point of clarity, and oftentimes this is where it happens, at a moment of suffering. When he doesn't have what he wants, when he's exposed to the absence of need and resentment is flaring, in that context, he ends up looking at things differently. Having had a moment of clarity, he decides what he will tell his father. He is unworthy of being received as a family member. His request is simply for daily care and sustenance as a day laborer. There are 3 levels of laborer. Day laborer is the bottom. And they are provided with a place to stay and things to eat. And that's what he will approach his father and asks that his father would allow him to be a day laborer. The son departs and carries out his resolution to return and confess. The reason why he can make that journey is because his thinking has changed. Little can he anticipate the response that awaits him, but while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. I've heard it said, when you think about this story, how could he see him when he was a long way off? He was looking for him. He let him make his choice, and he waited for him to return. Seeing him a long way off, was filled with compassion for him and ran to his son, threw his arms around him, kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." And then the focus of this parable is, well, it talks about the younger son and the older brother, and they are players. We'll talk about them in upcoming weeks. The real focus of this parable is the father. He becomes the center of the story. Surely the son must have wondered how the father would respond to his confession. I wonder what he'll do. I wonder if he'll let me be a day laborer. I wonder if he will ask me what I did with the money. I wonder if he'll ask me, "Don't you have any money left?" He doesn't have to wonder long. The father runs to him. Gives him a giant hug, breaking all protocol. The father spots him while he's still far away and reacts immediately with compassion and acceptance. But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found," so they began to celebrate. The father receives the son back as a son, not as a servant. He doesn't even respond to his request that he would be considered a day laborer. He doesn't get another third of the estate. He's already spent the inheritance that he receives. However, the servants are told to clothe the son immediately and put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. The father has regained a lost son, the son he expected never to see again. I'm not sure if that's right. I think he expected to see him again. He was waiting for him, looking for him to return, knowing what would happen. It says, meanwhile, the older son. Any oldest children here? We know exactly what this kid feels. Exactly. That's right, of course. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house at the end of the day, he heard music and dancing. I got to say this. Oh, it's a bad joke, but no. Okay. How could a praying knee be attached to a dancing foot? And the answer is by a fatted calf. Okay, here we go. Okay, I told you. So, he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." Again, we oldest children don't have much of a problem understanding the older brother. They say in terms of family, the way family things seem to work, it's in some places it does. The oldest children tend to be the heroes, doing everything. The next one, the rebel. They look at, and I can't keep up with him or her, so I'm just going to bag it. Third one's the clown. They just kind of make light of the whole thing, and they talk about the fourth being the lost child. At any rate, the older son, who always did his duty, had been laboring in the field, and his brother came home sometime during the workday. The party was going on when he returned, thrown together pretty quickly. So at the end of the day, he comes back. As the elder brother approaches the house, he hears music and dancing, and is not pleased when he understands what the festivities are about. The older brother became angry, refused to go in. So his father went out, pleaded with him. He answered his father, "Look!" Yeah, some heat there, I think. All these years I've been, isn't that an interesting word? All these years I've been slaving for you. Indicates the belief system that the older brother has. He thinks like a slave, and he lives with a master. I wonder if that's why. Maybe I wonder what that contributed to the younger son leaving. If that's life with Dad, I don't want anything with it. No, we don't know. Anyways, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Seems kind of military, doesn't it? Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed the fattened calf for him. You know what the older son demands? Something that we understand. Justice. Justice. You know, Judaism had room for repentance and forgiveness. Judaism had room for that. However, immediate acceptance of people as righteous was difficult to accept. He hadn't proven himself. He hadn't had time to indicate whether this change was deep or not. The full acceptance of repentant people before they could achieve a holy lifestyle and track record, that contradicted their thinking about God. And that's why this father is a prodigal father. He shouldn't have extended this kind of open welcome and forgiveness to somebody who hasn't proved he's sincere. Anyway, the father goes on being who he is. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. This story is really about the parties, the people that Jesus is with. There's Jesus, and he is portrayed by the Father. There's tax collectors and sinners, because this is who Jesus is speaking to. And this story kind of gives a place to each of the three parties. Jesus is represented by the Father. The tax collectors and sinners, they are being portrayed by the younger brother. The Pharisees and teachers of the law, they are being portrayed by the older brother. So each of them is in the story. Jesus paints a portrait with this story, and he gives it to the tax collectors and sinners, and he also gives the same story, the same picture to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law on behalf of the Father. To the tax collectors and sinners, he points to the Father and the prodigal son, and to them he says, this is God and you. That's God and you. That's, you matter to God. He wants a connection with you. He is not distancing himself. He wants to connect. And that's the way Jesus, did they have things that they needed to correct? Did they have things in their life that needed to change? Yeah, they did. You know the way it works? We've talked about this before. With the way it works with God, it's connection, then correction. The law is correction, then connection. It's correct your behavior. If you bring about enough changes in behavior, then you can connect with God. Correction, then connection. Jesus came and he flipped that upside down. What he came and talked about is connection, then correction. Would you agree with me? That's a really big difference. If I look at you, say, you know that issue you deal with? You know the issue. Tell you what, you clean that up from your life, and then we'll have a connection. Okay? What do you say? You get rid of that behavior. You fix it. Put it behind you, and then we'll have a connection. That's the way they understood. That's what they understood from the Old Testament of the Bible. Jesus comes along and he switches it. There's still things to change, but you know what Jesus would end up saying? Follow me. But what follow me? And in the context of this connection, how about if we work on this attitude thing that you have? Not correction and connection, connection and correction. That's the way it works that's the way it works with God. That's what he's like. Sure, there's things we need to change. But you know what needs to change first in order for our behavior to change? Our beliefs. God's distancing from you because you don't do it well and say it right. You know what Jesus says? Wrong picture. It's not what he's like. He doesn't just give him the picture of the father and the prodigal son. That hit him in the gut. The next one took their breath away, I think. He paints the same picture. See this guy up in the middle, the guy questioning the servant. The servant has the clothes that the father told him to get for the son. I think that's the older brother. And that's what is this picture represents. He's quite, what are you doing? This image of the older brother being on the outside of a connection at this point with the father, he gives that image to the tax collectors and sinners. And by the way, this is God and them. And it shocks them because they always believe that, well, I can't matter to God because I can't work as hard as they do. It's what causes the rebel next to the oldest child to say nuts to that. I can't beat that. I can't be as good as. And what he says is, well, what is he saying? Is it wrong to be righteous? No. You know what he doesn't want us to be? Self-righteous. Self-righteous. It seems that self-righteousness was a thing that was harder for Jesus to deal with than unrighteousness. These tax collectors and sinners were unrighteous, and what he offers them is connection and correction, and they take him up on it. But the Pharisees and the tax collectors, they were self-righteous, and they looked at themselves and they looked down their nose at others that didn't work as hard as they did, and that self-righteousness, that doesn't make it on many sin lists, does it? When you think of what is it that God disapproves of? There's the list we have. The most difficult one for Jesus to deal with was self-righteousness, not unrighteousness. Jesus didn't have much of a problem with the tax collector's sinner, it doesn't seem. He couldn't shake a Pharisee. Yeah. By the way, he gives this same picture, flips them to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, gives them the picture of the father and the prodigal son, and he said, this is God and them. And with the elder brother, surprises them, this is God and you. The good news. Good news and not so good news. The good news is that you matter to God. Not if you clean up this or that. Not you'll matter to God if you. There's no ifs. You matter to God. You know what the not so good news is? They matter to God too. Who is your them? Republicans, Democrats, Palestinians, Jews? They matter to God too. Let's stand for closing prayer. Father, thank you for the stories and for Jesus coming, clarifying, helping us to know how to think about you. About you is central, seminal. And it makes or breaks our Christian life. You would have us understand that we can come to you as we are, and that you connect with us in order to correct us. You change the way we think about you. That changes the way we think about life. It changes what we do. It all begins with beliefs. And that's why you want us to make room for your word in our mind, because it'll change the way we think about you. It's not just to give us a list of do's and don'ts. You tell us mostly about yourself and what you're like. And as that becomes part of our thinking, it softens our heart. And it allows us to be more responsive. Thanks for that. And thanks for the chance we have to be able to enjoy sitting down with one another and eating together, just like they did in this story. Thanks for the hands that prepared it. In Jesus' name, amen.